No.
But it's a great pleasure to welcome Jeff Boase here. I've known you for,
I don't know, 15 at least? No.
It would have been closer to 25.
Oh, you're right. That's how it feels, like 15. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely a lot more.
Yeah.
I've known Jeff a long time.
Right.
He was a promising doctoral student, studying under Barry Wellman at the University of Toronto. Jeff has been doing really amazingly intricate work and thinking about how we use technology to connect with each other. And there are many ways that we can use technology. In days of old, you could just write letters. Days of my old, you could just get on the landline and call people as at a distance. But of course, now we have so many ways to connect. And there's so many different ways qualitatively and quantitatively. And so Jeff is really one of the leading scholars in the world. And just with this book, but also his continued research, looking at the intricacies of connection in the 21st century. And I will note that there are various reasons Jeff is regularly in the Boston area, if I might share. So he's also someone that, is pretty much around in town every month or so. So if you ever want to connect, speaking of connecting, proximity, despite all the technology, it's always great to have a cup of coffee with someone. So I'm sure Jeff would be game.
Absolutely.
People here as well. So it's sort of a double bonus. So really excited to have Jeff in town and good to reconnect.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming out. I know it's the end of the semester. Things are busy, so I really do appreciate your time. I'm really excited to share this with you, right? So as David mentioned, this is based on a book. It just came out in March, Oxford University Press, and I'm sort of really just happy because it's really been many years in the making, not only the writing of the book, but the data collection and everything else. So I'm really happy to share that with people. And so, wait a second. Okay, we're good. So motivating the book was just a really simple question, which is what are the social implications of constant connectivity, right? Because now we have these computers in our pocket and they're always technically connected to the internet, right? And we feel in some ways that we're also by extension connected, although we're not always using them at every moment. There's still that possibility for being summoned or connected with in various ways through these devices. And so obviously that can change our relationships. And for me, relationships are not just personal relationships, but people we know from work, right? Family, everyone in our personal networks counts as a relationship for me. And I come from a background in social network analysis, taking an egocentric approach. And so as you'll see when we get into some of the results, this is sort of the sort of stuff I focused on. So just to give you some context, not everyone's too familiar with mobile scholarship. And that's sort of where I start off. So thinking about earlier studies of mobile phone use, right? When mobiles just started coming on the scene in the 90s, there were a number of different kinds of findings that all sort of triangulated in different ways. So I'll just go through a few of those, right? So one of the early findings was this idea of mobile bonding, that we have these devices, and what are we using them for? To connect with people we're already close to, close friends and family. And so that was a very common thing. And it happened in various ways. So Misa Matsuda termed this idea of selective sociability. So now we have, even back then as well, we have like call display. We know who's calling, and we are sort of deciding who we can communicate with more actively because of that awareness of who's calling or who may be texting or whatever else. And so again, we tend to focus on people we already know, right? That was sort of the main finding there. And that led to this idea of telecocooning, which is that because we're connected mostly with these close friends and family, there creates this sort of situation where we tend to sort of have our worldviews confirmed in various ways because we tend to associate with people who have similar worldviews. And that creates these monadic clusters, which means that we're sort of grouped off potentially and not exposed to new ideas, and of course, political leanings, of course, will be reinforced and so on. And all of this has been termed bounded solidarity. That's we are sort of connected, but in a very bounded way. So that's what those studies basically found. And I will say most of these studies were conducted in post-industrialized economies, right, where people were early adopters of these technologies and, comparatively well off. And so if you think about it, why is it the case that all these findings converged? Well, there's this idea that maybe technology is causing this to happen, that by giving people devices of this nature, maybe that's what's actually influenced us to connect in these ways, right? And so there's this underlying assumption of technological inevitability or determinism, if you will. And if you look at the devices, it kind of also makes sense because this is what an old phone looked like. Anyone seen this kind of thing before? Yeah. This used to look new to me, right? So that's where I'm at. But you would see, so you might have a little screen there, but there was no internet necessarily at the time, or if there was, it was very, very limited. If you wanted to text someone, you had like letters down here. So if you wanted to text letter C, you'd have to press 2-3 times to get the letter C and so on. So it's a very cumbersome process to text. And again, if you want to call someone, you'd have to know their phone number, right? So that's also, so it makes sense that you would only communicate with these devices with people you're already close to, because first of all, you don't have to type long messages to people you already know because they have a greater context of what you're doing. You don't have to say, hi, I was out at the store and I saw this thing and it reminded me of you. No, it's just more like, do you want bread, right? Or whatever. And again, because we had people on our phone books, we would only have people's phone numbers if we were typically close to them or had some meaningful connection, because it was a bit of a hassle to give someone the phone number and to put in your phone book, right? That was like a bit of a process. So again, this idea of technology of cause, well, there's some assumptions here though, right? The assumption is if you're going to be communicating with these closer relationships, that's coming at the expense of communication with other people who maybe you don't feel as close to and maybe who have different worldviews. And this sort of zero-sum hypothesis assumes this kind of like social displacement, that you displace one social activity with another. But of course, if you think about it, we do many things in the day that are not necessarily social and could be displaced as well, right? So yes, maybe I'll have more communication with my mom or my close friend, but that doesn't necessarily come at the expense of communication with these other people who I don't know so well. I could just be watching less TV, right? Or I could be doing things that are, or doing less of things that are sort of asocial. And also there's this concurrency possibility too with mobile devices, that you can interact with people and then you can take a little moment and interact with someone else. You don't have to stop interacting with someone completely to take a moment and respond to a text or whatever. We sort of work that into how we communicate, right? So I guess there's this possibility that, anyone heard the word phubbing? Right? Phubbing is this concept that you're sort of snubbing someone if you look at your phone during an interaction. But there are norms in lots of social groups where that's not necessarily a negative thing, right? Like everyone knows, oh, it's okay, you go take care of that thing, that little text, and then come back to me. It's not always necessarily going to end an interaction or break an interaction. So the point I'm getting at is, even though there's some intuitive value to thinking about technology as causing this shift towards more insular networks, it's not necessarily happening, right? And if you look at even early mobile studies, you look at how people are using phones in other parts of the world outside of these kinds of countries, or even in different groups within these countries, you find it's not actually the case that they're only connecting with closer relationships. So in my early research looking at teens in Tokyo, I found that although it's true they use the phones to stay connected to their close friends, they would also use them to connect with new people, right? People that they might want to be friends with. And part of the reason was that teens in Japan in general had very structured lives, still do. So they'll be a school day and then they go to cram school, they might go to a club after that. And so there's not a lot of time when they're away from adults where they can form new relationships. But when they do find people that they're interested in, they would like give them their numbers and they would actually spend the time to write longer messages, even though it was kind of cumbersome, because that allowed them to maintain these new relationships or build these new relationships. If you look at other places, like studies done in South Africa, the Philippines, Jamaica, there are a lot of studies that showed that these phones were used often by entrepreneurs or people with small businesses to coordinate, like supplies and to make sales, to communicate to potential customers. And they were very savvy about how they did this because it was expensive for them to use these. So they would share devices among groups of people. They would, swap SIM cards, right? So they don't have to buy many devices, and so on. So there's a lot of ways in which they use these devices to actually build new relationships, again, for economic reasons. And so again, this flies in the face of the idea that just because you give someone a piece of technology, they have to use it in a particular way, right? It may be the case that certain technologies orient themselves towards certain kinds of uses, but people can always be creative. They can always find other ways to use them. So this sort of leads to me sort of reframing or asking a related question. It's like, why is the same technology used differently among different populations, right? If there's nothing intrinsic about the technology that necessarily leads to a particular social outcome, then what is explaining these different uses? And of course, there's some theoretical ideas that are useful. So anyone heard of a technological affordance, that concept? Okay, so the idea is simply that, well, there's different schools of thought here, but sort of the rendition of the idea that I like is that technology provides opportunities for certain kinds of social interactions, right? And so it really depends on the user and what they want to do if they take advantage of those opportunities. And it also can provide some sort of natural constraints as well. But the point is that the person who's using it has a large influence in how it's used, which of course also makes intuitive sense. It's just not something that comes up when we're thinking of these technologically deterministic narratives, right? And so I like this approach because it helps to explain why things change when new technologies are introduced, but it's not too deterministic. The thing I don't like about it, though, is that it really brackets the social world. It doesn't give you a framework for understanding, well, what are these social things that influence people to use technologies in different ways, right? It doesn't give us a language for that. It just says, focus on a user and see what they want to do and see if they use the technology for those purposes or not. And so I was sort of thinking, well, how do I bring this into sort of my interest? And I come from a background in sociology. So this is a snapshot of my bookshelf. These are the sorts of things that I grew up reading, so to speak, right, in grad school. So you have like Giddens, Constitution of Society. There's a lot of stuff about reflexive modernity and so on. And these are all sorts of things that I'll be drawing on to sort of provide a framework that's consistent with the affordance approach, but not simply the affordance approach. So I'm calling this really the configuration approach. And so the idea here is that both relationships are configured, right? They provide these affordances, but also the social world is kind of configured in a way as well. So what do I mean by that? Well, drawing on a Giddens idea of structuration, if you think about it, we have these rules about social behavior, right, that help us function as a society and as people. So the very fact that you're all sitting there looking at me, you're not interrupting me, right? I'm able to sort of have the floor. That's a social rule. We don't have to follow that rule, but we tend to. That's why it's kind of a rule. And so you can think of that as a kind of social configuration. And then when we enact these rules, we're enacting agency, right? So the rules, like agency and structure are two sides of the same coin, right? As we enact the rules, they still are rules. If we don't follow them anymore and we make new rules, then they're no longer rules, right? So it's that sort of, again, that agency and structure is kind of, in a way, cyclical. And of course, we reflect on our actions. We decide if we want to follow the rules or not in particular situations. So that's reflexivity. And so sort of my way of thinking about this is actually, I think technology works in a very similar kind of way, right? If you look at technologies, it's so many rules, right? Like when you think of code, what is code? It's just a set of commands, a set of rules. If you think about even hardware, the way it's arranged, the materials used and so on, they all follow different kinds of rules, right? And so those rules are very much there, but at the same time, technologies are acting as these rules are being followed, right? We don't think of technologies as having agency in the way that humans have agency because we feel that we're kind of special in a way. But the special thing is not in the acting, it's actually in the reflexivity, right? The fact that we think before we act. That seems to be the big difference between us and technologies. And so at this point, of course, we don't have any real evidence that technologies are reflexive. Of course, with AI, that seems like it may be on the verge of being something that people do agree upon in the near future. But at this point, there's no evidence of that, and that's fine. But for my argument, it doesn't really matter, right? For my argument, I'm more interested in, okay, well, we have this framework, the affordance of thinking of again, configurations, rules of how technologies act, but they're still important in that they act. And then we have the same thing for humans. And it's when these things are sort of put together, we have what I'm calling practices of connection, which are reoccurring communicative actions in which humans and technologies exercise agency, affirming both social and technological rules. So just to make that a little more tangible, there's a practice that when you're sitting in this room, you're not going to pick up your phone and have a conversation, right? And that is a social practice. But also we configure our technologies so that they're on silent mode, right? So that they can't necessarily act in that way. And if we sort of forgot to put them on silent mode, we would do that as well. So here we have a situation with both humans and technologies are configured in particular ways that allowed for these practices to occur. And so that's the basic idea. Any questions about that or anything? Okay. I have to stop myself from talking about this too much because I find this really interesting to me personally. But I want to get on to the rest of it. So thinking of this as a framework, going back to that question of the social implications of constant connectivity, it kind of helps me think about it a little differently, which is what are these social and technological configurations that enable and constrain practices of connection in the presence of constant connectivity, right? So what are these sort of relevant configurations that help us understand why we have certain kinds of practices, right? Because those practices are the social implications of constant connectivity, if you think about it. So this is where I'm going to be a little sort of sociological and be a little historic about things. So I sort of think about these things in terms of trajectory, right? So pre-industrial life, people often would live and work with their family. They spend a lot of time with their family. And so they would have practices where they would simply be communicating with the same people all the time, right? It's very sort of simple social life. They may have smaller towns, and there were sets of people who are kind of nomadic, right? Who maybe would connect with different folks. But for the most part, people's social worlds were fairly small. Along comes industrialization. You have the rise of urban centers. You have the rise of factories. And suddenly family and work are separated, right? And people are interacting with folks outside of their home more often. Then sort of mid-industrialization, if you will, where we have the rise of larger organizations like hospitals and governments that are becoming more complex and so on. We have more what you can think of as role complexity, where you think of a doctor. Doctors can act differently with a patient than with other doctors than with nurses, right? So they're interacting with lots of different people all the time, right? And so the social life is becoming more complex. And they have these social rules to navigate that, these different understandings or configurations of what's appropriate with different people, how you ought to behave. And then more currently, you can think of post-industrialization or perhaps globalization, we have this more individualized culture where people tend to take on a variety of social roles, but not in sort of even long-term stable occupations or even long-term stable families, right? People are changing jobs quite a lot, and so that requires them to interact with new sets of people all the time. They're working on different projects with different sort of just-in-time models of coordination, which they have to, again, have very complex social arrangements. If you look at families, people are not married as often. They may be divorcing. They have different sets of people in their family who they interact with in different ways in different households and so on. Friends, of course, as well. You may have friends from all different parts of your lives, people from high school and so forth. So again, you interact with these people in different ways as well. So sort of summing this up, I'm arguing that there's sort of this trajectory of increasing social complexity, which is partly a result of institutional complexity, both in sort of work life and in family life. That's what I mean by institutions. There's this relational complexity where we have all these different kinds of social roles and different ways and sort of expectations about how we deal with different people. And then there's also temporal complexity in that a lot of people we communicate with are not necessarily people that we're seeing in person on a regular basis because we have irregular schedules. We have these jobs in which we can work from home, that we can interact with people for different purposes, and they may be in different time zones and so forth. Again, families may be living scattered across the world and so forth. So that's the argument, increasing social complexity. Is that all good? Is it making sense? Or yeah, okay. And then I make the case there's also been a sort of mirror increase in technological complexity, right? So of course, one of the main sort of ways that people communicate, aside from in person, would be through the printing press, pre-industrial times. Then with industrialization, we had postal services, we had rails that allowed us to sort of move around a little more and connect to people that way. Then mid-late industrialization, we had the rise of mass telecommunication systems, which were really critical again for for social life and allowed for the rise of suburbs as well, because people were able to sort of stay in touch with folks that they had to do things with over greater distances. And then with sort of post-industrialization or globalization, we now have very complex structures that we call the internet, the cellular systems. All of these things really are allowing for lots of different kinds of communication possibilities. And so one way of thinking about that complexity, this is actually sort of a glimpse at some of the research. So in the research, we interviewed a lot of people, and we had them just sort of like list off all the different media they use to communicate with different kinds of relationships. And this just gives you a sense, right? So for each of these different kinds of media, they also allow for different kinds of media within them as well. So for example, Facebook Messenger, you could do text messages, pictures, right? You could do video messages and so forth. It allowed for lots of different media. So this is very complex, right? All these options are very complex. And we can also sort of configure our devices such that they're individually allowing for different kinds of interactions, where I can configure my phone that it's only going to ring if it's a call from my kids or something like that, right? And if it's anyone else, it goes to silent mode. So the devices themselves that are running all these different apps are fairly complex, right? So you have, again, variety of apps allowing for all this communication. Within apps, you have a lot of media options, and you can individualize, configure all these different kinds of apps for notifications and other things. So you can see that these two things seem to be working in parallel: social complexity and technological complexity. And the title of the book is The Digital Bind, because I argue it's like when all of these things intersect with our practices of connection, that we are sort of bound to the digital, right? We have that kind of bind. And that these practices, because they assume the availability of constant connectivity, that's also a way in which the bind becomes deeply embedded into social life, because social life can't really even occur without it. If you lost internet and you lost your mobile phones today, you cannot maintain the same social life that you've had, right? It just would be impossible. So how do people actually navigate these complex social and technological configurations? Right? How do we all make it work? Because we have so many options, we have so many people, it's a big mess, but somehow it seems to work, right? So what are the practices that allow us to work? So this is where I get into the empirical part of the research. And so one thing I did was develop an app for Android phones. I sort of spearheaded the development. I had a PhD student in computer science who actually did most of the work, and another master's student as well. So we developed this app, and I'll explain how it works in a moment. But then we wanted people to use the app, and I wanted like a study that would actually reflect the Canadian population, which obviously you probably know is not that much different than the US population in certain ways. And so I looked into research companies, and I wasn't really happy with like the methods that they were using to have respondents. So I decided I'm going to take a bit of a chance, and I'm going to mail out invitations to people to install this thing and use it. And my library had a very comprehensive database of mailing addresses in Canada, and we sort of did a little analysis just to make sure that urban rural things that we expect in terms of like population density would match up, and it looked pretty good. So we used these addresses, residential addresses, and sent out information about the app, how to install it, exactly how it works, what the research is about, and so on, in a way that was fairly intuitive, hopefully, for people to understand. But then, of course, people who install an app and participate in research are potentially kind of weird. So maybe it'd be a little less weird for people to do like an online survey. So I thought, okay, well, if these people are weird, let's compare them to people doing an online survey, but we'll make the survey that's done through the app and online exactly the same. And then we can compare the way that people respond to questions and see if there are like any obvious reason or biases potentially in sort of the sorts of people that would install this app. So that's what we did there. And there were no real major differences. I'll just talk about that in a moment. We also did in-depth interviews with 110 adults. So I had a team of students that I worked with and trained to do these interviews. And these interviews took the course over a few years. And they weren't randomly recruited, but we tried in some ways to recruit people in public spaces. We had students go through some of their personal networks, because the students at the University of Toronto are quite diverse in a lot of ways. And so we were able to, so really trying to get like a wide variety of people to do the interviews. So just to switch back to the app for a moment, how it worked. Basically, with the app, I wanted to see if it was possible to get some log communication data, because there are a lot of issues when you ask people to tell you what they've done on their phones, that they often are not very good at that. And I have a couple papers comparing self-report to digital trace data showing that's actually the case. And so this app, the way it would work is people would, they'll agree to it, they'll have information about how it works and so forth, and they'll be given a respondent ID. So anyone can download the app, but only people with respondent IDs could use the app. And that's just to make sure that we didn't have any sort of issues with recruiting. So they would insert this ID, and then the app would take time and dates of calls and text in the log. And the phone numbers, it would do like a hash encoding on the device. So we'd know if it's the same phone numbers that were, logged. So if you called your mother a few times, you would know it's the same number, but we wouldn't necessarily know it's your mother. We wouldn't have the content of text messages. Tried really hard not to get anything that would be sensitive to people. Probably also sort of like self-preservation. I just don't want to have a lawsuit or anything, right? I didn't want a lot of that sensitive data, and I didn't really need it. After they did that, then there would be an on-screen survey. And as part of that survey, we'd ask people to identify particular individuals based on criteria that would give them, and select those people from their contact book or their call log. And then the hash identifier associated with that person would be saved as a response to that question. So that way, we could identify, I'll talk about this in just a moment, but someone you work with, and then we would have like the calls and texts of communications with that individual. But of course, people communicate a lot more ways than just calls and text. Fortunately, at that time, WhatsApp wasn't really used in Canada. It was really just a default texting app, so that was pretty good. But we'd have self-report, like survey questions for other kinds of media. So as I mentioned, I was pretty happy actually with the recruiting here, because we didn't have a high response rate, as you can imagine. I think we had about a 4% response rate, but that's among anyone we asked, and there's only about 40% of the population that had used Android. So really it was more like 8-9%. And then when I compare the demographics, right, so this is the app survey when they installed the app. This is where they did the online version, but they didn't have to install an app. And then this is the census that was close to so like 2018, we did the recruiting here. And so, gender is exactly what you would expect. In terms of education, we had a few higher percentage of people with postgraduate degrees installing the app. Of course, they tend to be more educated, but like not major differences there. We still had a lot of people who only had high school diplomas and so on. People working, there was not a lot of good data for comparison, but at least in terms of like basic employment, exactly what you would expect. Totally mapped on the census. Age is the big difference. So 33 median years for people who installed the app, 43 for those who did the survey, and that's more in line with the general population. But we still had a pretty good spread in terms of age. We still had people in their 60s, 70s installing the app. So overall, it looked pretty good that way. Any questions about that? So on to the findings. So I think
sorry, Jeffrey, can I ask one question?
Yeah, please.
So I'm wondering about, since you had the full address book, like all the people that were mailed, right? Did you also compare with that sample of all the people who were reached out to versus those who installed the app, or basically is that reflected in the Canadian census itself?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by the address book and how it relates to the Canadian census.
Yeah, I'm just curious about do you have the demographics, I guess, of the people who were all initially reached out to?
No, so we had their addresses, right?
Okay.
And so now we did, as I mentioned, we looked at the percentage of addresses in urban, suburban, rural areas, and it did match on to the census as well for the most part. So that, yeah, it looked pretty good. And also the number of addresses was in line with what you'd expect for residential. It's I think 23 million or so. And there's 36 million people in Canada. So yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so let's get on to the findings here. So I sort of want to go through sort of high level the findings, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the actual results from the surveys. So I sort of found I was trying to make sense of, again, how do people navigate these complex relationships using all these different media? And I found sort of three practices that seemed really pertinent for that. So one was what I'm calling media situatedness, another was division of media, and the other was temporal boundaries. So I'll talk about each of those, and I'll draw in quotes from the interviews to try and illustrate them. So media situatedness, here's a quote. I call my mom because she sucks at texting, but at work she always has Facebook open, so it's easier to send a message through my laptop on Messenger. So what's happening here? Well, it's a very reflexive thing. This person knows her mother well enough to know that during this time of day, she won't be available. And that even if she was available, she doesn't like to text. So decided to use Messenger for that reason. And so you can see that it's very situational, right? All these factors in determining whether or not, you reach out through a message or a messenger or just call them or whatever else. Like you have to know a lot about the person, and it depends on the situation that the person is in. And so this was a very sort of constant sort of finding that it's not that people would just have like one type of media that they use for one type of relationship. And in fact, when I started looking at the results of the survey, it was quite frustrating because I was hoping that certain kinds of relationships would sort of favor a certain kind of media, but it wasn't the case. A lot of people use lots of different kinds of media for lots of different kinds of relationships. And then the reason is, again, because they're sort of embedded in these very sort of complex social worlds where they have a lot of different factors they need to consider. They need to think about the person, they need to think about the person if they're at work or at home, what they're doing, and so on. This is particularly true for the closer relationships. So that's one practice that sort of seemed to be very common and helps explain sort of why people use all these different media. Another practice, oops. Oh, sorry, before I get onto that, I just wanted to give you another example of that. This is my son, Ko, right? So he's in Toronto. And this is a quote from him. He said this recently. He's like, aren't devices pretty neat? You're all the way in Boston, but I can still chat with you. Right? So he's sort of reflecting on, oh, dad's away. And he didn't usually text me. He rarely texts me, right? But I was away, and he knew that I was out with colleagues, and I want to be able to pick up the phone or a FaceTime call. So he thought, okay, I can send dad a text. And then I reflected, oh, that's so cool. I still stay in touch with dad, even though the situation's so different. Right? So there's another example of him sort of being aware, reflexively understanding there are different kind of contextual factors and choosing a medium based on that. And in case there was any doubt, again, people use a lot of different media, right? So this is sort of just basically in terms of their mobile activities. Yeah, like everyone's calling, everyone's texting, but still a lot of people are emailing, right? And remember, this is for all different ages. So people aren't really that interested in email, and people don't really like email, but email is still used quite a lot. And of course, social media apps as well, of course, are huge. But now this is 2018. Maybe the numbers a little higher for social media apps, but nevertheless, the point is people are drawing lots of different media all the time. And again, I think it's because they have so many different people in their lives, and lots of different relationships, lots of different situations. They choose the media that makes the most sense for any individual in any given kind of context. Okay, another sort of practice, if you will, is what I'm calling division of media. So here's a quote. Facebook is for friends and family and some neighborhood acquaintances. Instagram is a mixed bag. Twitter is mostly business. Snapchat is fun. I use it for my family and one close friend. So the idea here is simply that, yes, we can use lots of media to reach out to any particular individual, but also that our different kinds of relationships tend to group up in different kinds of media or different kinds of apps, right? And this is, again, partly because when we have a bunch of complex relationships, maybe we have some friends from high school, we have some people we used to work with, and so forth. Like there's a history where we might have, a messaging app that we tend to use, and it's nothing about the app necessarily that draws us to it. It's just that we're using it with that group of people, right? And it used to be like Facebook was a way of keeping in touch with high school friends, and then it moved over Instagram. And again, there's sort of like different reasons that could happen over time, but there's just generally this grouping of people into different kinds of apps often. And again, it's because we have lots of different relationships and lots of different possibilities. So there's this sort of like historic trajectories that sort of occur there. And the last thing is what I'm calling temporal boundaries. So here's a quote. If I message my parents on WhatsApp, they don't have to read it right away. They can read it later on. They can reply to it later on. And this is someone whose parents live in Hong Kong and he lives in Toronto. And so this idea is very simply that the way that we're able to function is by not interrupting each other all the time, right? We have temporal boundaries. And this is really critical because we have these devices that are constantly connected. If we didn't have these boundaries, these understandings of when it's appropriate to use devices, when it's appropriate to have different kinds of communication, we just couldn't manage it all. So these boundaries are really critical. And they're also very much influenced by power, because if we don't have control over our own boundaries, this is when we sort of lack the ability to navigate our own social worlds and more determined for us. So one quote would be, because my manager wants to be in touch with me, so I'm keeping my phone on my desk. Now I have that thing in front of me all the time, so I will see it. So this is someone who works as a secretary. Her boss always wants her available, and she really doesn't like it. Not very happy about that, but doesn't have any choice, right? That's like, there's this power difference there. And so she doesn't have control of her own temporal boundaries when she's at work. And sometimes that bleeds over into home when people take their work home with them. It's not necessarily because they even want to all the time. It's because their colleagues or people who sort of have power over them are expecting them to be available, right? And so they're sort of, again, they don't have control of their own boundaries. So those are the main practices. Now, as I mentioned, there's a strong quantitative part to this. I know there's a lot of quantitative research that goes on here. Normally, I wouldn't get into the quantitative part because there's quite a lot to cover, but I'm just going to focus on the work that was done in the context of working relationships. And in the book, I also explore friendship and family as well, but I just don't have time to get into a lot of that. So I'll just focus on the results to do with work. And again, if you remember, I've sort of made the case that over time, there's been increasing social complexity in the context of work, in that people are often in these sort of knowledge occupations where they have to sort of do a lot of managing, connecting with different people. They're experts on certain things. And those occupations tend to be common in sort of post-industrialized economies. So here's Canada, not surprising, 33% of the people who did the survey, they didn't choose this. I sort of like asked them for their job titles, and then I sort of grouped them off this way. 43% were sort of in service-related occupations, 12% in public sector, and then 9% in goods production. So people in the knowledge and service type jobs will tend to, according to my argument, have more social complexity because they'll be interacting with lots of different people through their jobs. Whereas people in goods production, not necessarily, they're just producing things, right? They don't have to interact with others to do that production for the most part. So in the survey, we asked people to select one person with whom they work. And I would have loved to have more information than just one relationship. But the problem is, of course, in a survey, you have to be really selective on what you ask people. And so because I wanted to ask questions about all the different kinds of media that they use to connect, and because at work they may connect with people in different ways and different media, I thought it was really just sort of feasible to focus on one tie that they would think of, and then they would select through the app. And again, I get that sort of encoding phone number that's associated with that, encoded phone number. And then we had a bunch of like self-report questions as well. So I'll go through some of the self-report, and then I'll go through the results that were to do with the calling and texting. So if you look at this, there's like a lot of similarities in people who are in knowledge service and public sector occupations. So again, this is like one person we asked, like, in the last week, have you emailed them, called, text? We also asked questions about social media, but given the context of work, it wasn't used so much. I would include those. And so you could see like people in knowledge occupations, with this person, 70% of the time they would have emailed them in the last week, 49% of the time texted, and 47% called. And so this is about like 2.6 media on average. So, like not too many big surprises here. Of course, email is a little more common than in, say, service or public sector occupations, not surprising. But people are still using a lot of different media. And in the goods production, you find a lot less contact through all different kinds of media and fewer email used, right? We also asked a question about, like, do they have rules that limit them at work? And some of the big differences are more between the knowledge and service versus the public and goods production. Even public and goods production have a lot more restrictions, right, on using the mobiles at work. And then if you looked at the log data, this is interesting. You see more calling and more texting in these occupations. And again, this is with the one tie that they identify. So basically, they're communicating with fewer media, but more frequently with the ones they do communicate with, at least in terms of calling and texting. So just sort of to sum up a little bit here, knowledge and service workers, they have diverse media use, but low contact in each media generally, or at least the ones that we can measure. goods production, less diverse media, higher contact, and public service was a bit of a mix there. Yes?
Just remind when the data was collected.
2018 for the survey, yeah.
Right, great. So this was, this is before things like Slide, really.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Right. Now, we did have interviews that were sort of ongoing. So we had some that went on up to like 2022. So we did capture some of that in the interviews, but not in the surveys yet. Okay, so why is this the case? So let's go to the interview for some insights. And I'm just going to focus on knowledge versus good production because they're kind of like two extremes. So this is a quote from, or actually a number of quotes from Mohammed, who is a sales manager in a large hotel chain. So let's see for time, okay. So he says, he's describing his day and who he communicates with and how he communicates. He says, 7 to 8, I finish all my emails. 8 to 8:30, I arrange my desk because my job starts at 8:30. 8:30 to 9:30, I spend some time with my boss, so that's in-person, schedule meetings and so on. 9:30 to 12 is email and responses. 12 to 1 is lunch. 1 to 4, I go on sales calls, find new clients. 4 to 5:30, I spend time with my team, train them, help them, and so on. So, fairly like clear division of media throughout the day, different times a day, he focuses on different kinds of media. But then he gets into sort of talking about how he uses his mobile phone. Even though he's not supposed to use it at work, he still uses it. He says, I have a mobile, but it's not given by my company. But I have it because a lot of my connections, I keep in touch with them on WhatsApp. Because a lot of my clients who are on a first name basis with me now prefer WhatsApp. They don't want to be called. So if there's anything regarding booking, pickups, cancellation, I deal with them on WhatsApp. So during office hours, I use my mobile sometimes to communicate with my clients, but otherwise it's restricted. We have emails, we have phones, right? So here we have like a number of things. Like, so there's a division of media because certain clients are on the one app. At the same time, there's this clear media situatedness. Okay, I'm at work. I'm only going to use WhatsApp for this purpose with these people. And that allows him to sort of be functional in that setting and sort of like keep up with the demands of his clients, but also try and use the phone in a way that, even though it's not sanctioned at work, it still helps him. On the other extreme, we have Ryan, who works at a chemical plant. So this is the quote. The supervisor will assign you what to do, and you are pretty much on your own for the rest of your shift, unless, of course, you are deviating from procedure or you need help to do something. Then you ask someone for help or tell a supervisor the situation, right? So very little power over who he communicates with, how he communicates, right? It's very regimented. He actually said he has to leave his phone in his car. Phones are not allowed in the chemical plant. And so lots of restrictions in that way. Very little people he communicates with, very regimented. So here again, we see like knowledge workers, high social complexity, and the communication spread over lots of different relationships. And it's through media situatedness and the visual media that the social complexity is kind of managed. Actually, less social complexity, higher communication with a smaller number of relationships, little power over temporal boundaries. Right? So this is just one way in which these practices help to explain the results of the survey. Right? I'll just very briefly go over some highlights to do with friends and family, and then I'll wrap up. Again, I didn't really have time to get into the quantitative side of this, but just some highlights are, with close friends and family, tend to require a lot of high situatedness because you know these people fairly well, you know when they're available, what media they prefer, and so on. And you tend to have a division of media where, like with your mom and your aunt, you might be on a WhatsApp group, right? And with your kids, you might do FaceTime and whatever else. With the weaker relationships, people sort of depend more on norms when they're selecting media. So if it's a weaker relationship, who's a friend, you haven't seen them for a while, okay, it's probably best to reach out by text first. People also use temporal boundaries to maintain emotional distance from people, especially from weaker family and sometimes friends, people they don't necessarily want to interact with a lot, right? So they're like, okay, I'll just text this person, right? I could call them, I could see them in person, but a text will be enough. And not surprisingly, power in regards to control or temporal boundaries was really a big issue between parents and children, especially children who are teenagers, right? So mom and dad want them to be available, they don't want to be available, right? And so that's sort of some tension there. Okay, so just sort of to wrap things up, as I mentioned, we've got this new thing, constant connectivity in a technical sense. And this is occurring within these very complex technological configurations, all these different media options, all different ways of configuring these media options. And we're in very complex relationships. We have lots of different people we know from family, work, and home. And we have to navigate all of that. It's through those practices of connection that we're able to sort of make it all work. And that's kind of the social implications of constant connectivity. And that's it. Thanks. Yes.
Enjoyed it, and I wanted to ask you a question that's maybe a little off to the side, but I figured I'd just kind of throw out a couple of the hot button things in the network analysis field that I've always been. So one is the sort of random veteran theory of the strength of weak ties,
right?
And the other is this thing that you hear actually with me a lot, which is Dunbar's number. I'm wondering, does your book cast new light on those kind of canonical concepts?
Well, the weak ties for sure, right? So, the thing with weak ties, first of all, this concept was developed in the 70s. So people were very limited in the communication options that they had with people. They tended to have relationships that they would see in person. There'd be a few long distance relationships or not. So, the idea that there's 4 dimensions to it, that they're all related, I think there's still, there's 4 dimensions, sure. But how do we think about staying in touch with people now? What's a weaker relationship in that context? I have a friend from high school. Maybe I haven't talked to them for a couple of years, but I'm on the job market and they sort of are in an occupation or maybe in a company where I want to work. So I get back in touch and then we have some a close connection. So that's a dormant tie and it becomes strong. So I think because we have more of these dormant ties, this sort of weak tie, strong tie distinction makes even less sense. The dimensionality is much more kind of complex now. So that's sort of one argument I make. And it's not only to do with dormant ties either, but you might feel close to people, but what does that mean in terms of like how you communicate with them, which media you use and which context? So for some people, if you're close, it sort of means like, oh, you better pick up the phone and call them. Okay, so you're calling them, but maybe for those people, other people, you feel close to them, but you almost never communicate with them as well, right? And when you do communicate, maybe it's sort of in a passive way of like liking something on Facebook or whatever. So are they a weak tie? I guess kind of, but you feel close to them, right? And that's always an issue that concept has, is that these communication and sort of cognitive closeness are like 2 very different things that tend to be lumped together. But I think it makes even less sense now.
The Dunbar's number, this sort of notion of some natural cognitive.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely for face-to-face interaction, it makes sense. But now that we have all these different media options and, we have platforms where we have folks that maybe, Dave and I were talking about this over lunch, like we kind of remember them, or maybe we never met them, but because they're connected to someone else, because we have an interest in maybe, again, working in a particular occupation or reaching out to them in some way, then we connect with them. So Dunbar's logic is simply that our brains aren't able to hold so many names and faces, but that doesn't seem to matter now because we don't have to know the names and faces. The platform might recommend somewhere we just actively find them through an existing connection. So whether or not we're connected to them doesn't really matter. We'll still connect to them at some point, potentially.
And, I think the research of like suggesting, look, how many weak ties we'll have,
right,
is orders of magnitude more than Dunbar. So like,
right,
it's it's it doesn't really hold up very well beyond your research right there.
Yeah.
But, if you try to come up with estimates of people, size of people's networks, all those weak ties,
right,
it gets into very.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, those people, we don't even know those connections until perhaps in some context it makes sense to know them, and then they could suddenly become close in some ways too, maybe because in the sense that they provide really important information for us and kinds of support as well. So, yeah, no problem. Yes?
Yeah, this was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trained as a sociologist. I love that.
Oh, cool.
Larger.
Great.
I'm curious about, and this is also coming from cursory following popular debates around the global warming. There's like one set of questions about how we manage existing relationships, and there's questions about how relations evolve. That also seems really simple. That question about the implications of technology to the social world. And I'm curious, yeah, just your thoughts on that. That was something you're in this study. And yeah, how technology might be
right. Yeah, in this study, I didn't look so much at the formation of relationships, but I have been thinking a lot, and especially the formation of romantic relationships with dating apps, right? Because it used to be for romantic partners, like you would find them through your friends or like maybe from work, or like you had these sort of like institutional ways that we would have to find people. And now we have these platforms that allow us to make ties for people we never would have been exposed to before. So that's really fascinating to me, but I have no results about that, or yeah. But have you thought about this in other ways?
Not in an informed way.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. Yeah. Yes, at the back.
There's one thing years of most previous research and said that technology will be can be automated more. But people actually are more about our and be more anxious about social lives.
Right.
Whether you observe that how or why during the process of.
So the question is this issue of people feeling anxious about
Feel more and
more lonely. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's just like a trope that's always there. Whenever a new technology comes along, there's this idea that it's going to ruin social life. And I don't think it's ruined necessarily. It's just provided different kinds of possibilities. And so some people will take advantage of those and some people won't. So people who tend to be extroverted will probably be very active in different ways on different kinds of media platforms to try and make relationships. People who are more introverted, maybe not. People who are in kinds of occupations where it's important for them to maintain lots of different kinds of relationships will be probably more active than people who are like in, maybe the public sector or people in goods production where that's not necessary for them, and so on. So I sort of see it as, I don't think just because you give people new technologies, they're going to become isolated, but people are probably going to be more aware of their social situations as practices are always changing. And some people who are really good at sort of developing practices that will allow them to fulfill certain goals may feel positive about it, and people who maybe are not in situations where they can develop those practices, or perhaps those practices aren't really in line with their general sort of psychological dispositions, might feel isolated and anxious as well. So, things are definitely changing. There'll be sets of people who are anxious. There'll be sets of people who are feeling good about it. But it's very complex, right? It really depends on the kinds of relationships.
More easily.
Right. No, I mean, because of my background in sociology, I don't focus so much on like psychological things like anxiety and so on. I will say though, like during a lot of the interviews, people just didn't spend a lot of time talking about how they felt so anxious about using technology. It's just something they were doing, and because it was often the context of like, oh, you're this family member or this friend from high school or whatever, right? And when they talk about it in those ways, they don't have any concerns. Sometimes if you ask people to step back and reflect on it, they might say, oh yeah, no, it's a big problem, but they don't say that they personally feel it to be a problem.
Maybe